The barrel of the .45 was cold, pressed firmly against Park Di-hyun's temple. In the rain-slicked shadows of the East District, Kang Joon-Seok didn't look like a killer. In his pristine black suit and silk tie, he looked like a judge. And his verdict was final: death for the man who stole from the syndicate. Di-hyun was on his knees, a broken mess of tattered clothes and blood, pleading for a mercy that Joon-Seok didn't believe in. 6 enforcers stood like a wall of stone, watching for the signal. The hammer clicked back. The neighborhood held its breath. But then the human wall broke. A small, frantic figure burst into the circle of light. It wasn't a rival hitman or a cop. It was a 7-year-old girl named Minna. Before the enforcers could move, she did the unthinkable. She lunged forward and grabbed Joon-Seok's sleeve with hands stained by the grime of the streets. "Please don't kill him," she begged, her voice a fragile blade in the dark. "It wasn't him, it was me." Joon-Seok froze. No one touches the boss. No one interrupts an execution. And certainly, no one confesses to a mafia crime to save a traitor. Kang Joon-Seok had ruled the district for over a decade with 2 ironclad principles. Debts are always paid in blood, and emotion is a terminal weakness. In his world, the iron rules weren't just guidelines. They were the law that kept the peace. People in the neighborhood knew the drill. When Joon-Seok's black sedan pulled into an alley at midnight, you closed your shutters, you locked your doors, and you made sure your children were fast asleep. But tonight, the rules were failing. As Joon-Seok stood over the cowering Park Di-hyun, he saw more than just a man who had lost the syndicate's money. He saw a community at its breaking point. His enforcers, a paramilitary unit dressed in identical black, stood as silent witnesses to the impending execution. They represented the overwhelming power of the mafia, a force no ordinary father could ever hope to fight. Yet as Minna clutched the boss's expensive suit, the air changed. Usually when people looked at Joon-Seok, they saw a monster. But as this little girl looked up with tears carving paths through the dirt on her face, she didn't see a monster. She saw a last resort. Joon-Seok looked down at her small, trembling hands on his sleeve. In 15 years, no one had dared to touch him without permission. His men reached forward to tear her away, but with a single, slight movement of his hand, Joon-Seok stopped them. He wasn't sure why, but for the first time in his life, the judge wanted to hear the defense. The rain didn't fall so much as it drifted, a fine, cold mist that turned the neon lights of the district into blurred smudges of red and blue. In the narrow gut of the alleyway behind the luxury high-rise, the air tasted of wet concrete and expensive tobacco. Kang Joon-Seok stepped out of the rear of the black sedan, his polished leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the damp pavement. He didn't look like a man about to commit a murder. He looked like a man arriving for a board meeting. His 6 enforcers had already prepared the court. They stood in a perfect semicircle, a human wall of black fabric and muscle that effectively erased the rest of the world. In the center of that ring, illuminated by the harsh, flickering beam of a single security light, was Park Di-hyun. Joon-Seok approached with a slow, predatory grace. He adjusted his slim black tie, his expression as unreadable as a slab of granite. To him, this wasn't about cruelty. It was about the math of the underworld. Di-hyun had been a courier, a man trusted to move the lifeblood of the organization, and $50,000 had vanished under his watch. In Joon-Seok's world, a missing sum was a missing soul. "The debt is documented, Di-hyun," Joon-Seok said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that carried no anger, only a terrifying finality. "I took you in when the construction sites wouldn't hire a man with a limp. I gave you a way to feed your family." Di-hyun let out a ragged sob, his knees scraping against the grit of the alley. His face was a map of fresh trauma, eyes swollen and blood trickling from a split lip where the enforcers had already interrogated him. "I didn't take it, boss," he wheezed, his hands trembling as he held them up in a desperate, useless shield. "I swear on my life, the bag was empty when I reached the drop point. Please, I have a daughter." Joon-Seok didn't flinch. He had heard the names of daughters and sons and mothers 1,000 times before. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and drew the handgun, the metal gleaming dully in the rain. He placed his left hand on Hyun's shoulder, a gesture that felt almost like a priest's blessing, though the weight behind it was the crushing gravity of a death sentence. "Your daughter will be provided for," Joon-Seok whispered, leaning down so only the condemned man could hear him. "That is my mercy, but the rules are what keep us from being animals, and you broke the rules." The boss straightened his back, his grip on the weapon relaxed but lethal. He looked at the shadows, waiting for the flicker of doubt that never came. He was the judge, the jury, and now the executioner. He began to squeeze the trigger, the world narrowing down to the click of the hammer, until a desperate, high-pitched scream tore through the silence of the court of shadows. The scream was thin and sharp, a jagged glass shard cutting through the heavy silence of the alley. Before the hammer of the .45 could fall, the solid wall of black-clad enforcers buckled. A shadow, small and frantic, darted through the gap between two of the largest men. They were trained to react to gunmen, to rival gangs, and to the police, but they were utterly paralyzed by the sight of a 7-year-old girl charging into their midst. Minna didn't hesitate. She didn't look at the guns or the cold, stone faces of the men who surrounded her father. She threw herself forward, her sneakers splashing through the oily puddles, and lunged for Kang Joon-Seok. The enforcers moved instinctively to intercept her, their large hands reaching out to snatch her from the air, but Joon-Seok raised his free hand in a sharp, silent command. They froze, their fingers inches from her light jacket. No one had ever challenged them like this. No one had ever dared to disrupt the judge in the middle of a sentence. Minna collided with Joon-Seok's legs, her small hands catching the pristine fabric of his trousers, her knuckles white as she gripped him for support. She was gasping for air, her simple ponytail coming undone as rain matted her hair to her forehead. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror, yet her eyes, wide and burning with a fierce, desperate light, never left the boss's face. "Get back, Minna, run," Hyun wailed from the ground, his voice cracking with the agony of a father watching his child enter the lion's den. But Minna didn't run. She stood her ground between the cold steel of the handgun and her father's heart. She looked up at Joon-Seok, her chest heaving, and did the one thing no adult in the district would ever dream of doing. She reached out and grabbed the sleeve of his $5,000 suit with her mud-caked fingers, pulling him toward her. The enforcers watched in stunned disbelief. To touch Kang Joon-Seok without permission was a death sentence. To stain his clothes was an insult beyond measure. They waited for the boss to shove her aside, to grow cold with fury, or to signal them to remove the complication. Instead, Joon-Seok looked down at the tiny hand on his arm. He felt the heat of her skin through the expensive wool, a stark, living contrast to the cold rain and the cold metal in his other hand. For the first time in 15 years, a human being was touching him not out of fear, not out of greed, but out of a love so powerful it had blinded her to the presence of death. The neighborhood remained silent, but the atmosphere in the alleyway had shifted. The court of shadows had been invaded by a light it wasn't prepared to handle. Joon-Seok slowly lowered the gun, his unreadable gaze locked onto the trembling girl who refused to flinch. The silence in the alleyway was heavy, broken only by the erratic rhythm of Minna's breathing. Kang Joon-Seok remained motionless, his eyes tracking the tear that escaped her eye and vanished into the dark wool of his sleeve. He was a man who lived by facts and ledgers, yet nothing in his experience prepared him for the weight of this child's gaze. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the city. "He didn't lose it. He didn't do anything wrong." Hyun tried to crawl forward, his voice a broken rasp. "Minna, stop. Go to Mrs. Kim's, please just go." But she ignored him, her fingers tightening on Joon-Seok's arm as if she were trying to anchor him to the earth. "The bag was in the closet. I saw him crying over it because he didn't have enough for Mom. He told me Mom was gone to the stars, but I knew. I saw the papers from the hospital. I saw the bills he hid under the mattress. Joon-Seok's brow twitched, the only sign of the earthquake happening behind his mask of stone. He looked at the bruised father, then back to the daughter. "What did you do, Min-ah?" "I took it," she confessed, the words spilling out in a desperate rush. "I took the money from the black bag while he was sleeping. I knew if he saw it, he'd just cry more. I went to the man at the funeral hall, the one who said Mom couldn't stay there because we owed them. I gave it to him. I told him it was a secret gift from my dad so he wouldn't have to worry anymore." A sharp intake of breath hissed through the teeth of the enforcers. The missing 50,000 wasn't lost to a rival or a gamble. It had been used to buy a patch of earth for a woman the world had forgotten. Min-ah's face crumpled, her bravery finally fracturing into the raw grief of a 7-year-old. "I thought I was helping. I thought if the money was gone, he wouldn't have to choose between the bag and Mom. I didn't know the bad men would come for him. It was me. Please, kill me instead." Joon-Seok felt a phantom chill. He remembered a cold night 20 years ago, a different alley and a different boy who had stolen bread to keep a dying sister warm. He looked at his enforcers, specifically his lead lieutenant, whose eyes were darting toward the exit. The math was failing. If Min-ah had used the money for a funeral, the total would have been a fraction of the 50,000. The confession hadn't just revealed a daughter's love. It had exposed a jagged hole in the story his own men had told him. Joon-Seok didn't pull her hand away. Instead, he slowly holstered the weapon, his gaze turning from the child to the loyal men standing in the shadows. The rain seemed to slow, the world blurring as the reflection in the oily puddles beneath Min-ah's feet pulled Joon-Seok backward through time. For a moment, the high-rise disappeared, and the luxury sedan faded into the rusted skeleton of a tenement block. He wasn't the man in the $5,000 suit anymore. He was a boy with hollow cheeks and bruised shins, standing in a doorway that smelled of damp rot and desperation. He remembered the weight of a stolen loaf of bread beneath his thin jacket, the same heavy, suffocating secret Min-ah was carrying now. He remembered his mother's cough, a dry, rattling sound that filled their single room, and the way he had looked at the local gang leader with a mixture of terror and worship. That man had offered him a choice: stay hungry and good, or eat and become a monster. Joon-Seok had chosen the monster. He had buried his innocence in that very same dirt, trading his heart for a seat at a table where debts were paid in blood. He had spent 15 years building a fortress of rules to ensure he would never be that vulnerable boy again. He believed that by becoming the judge, he had escaped the grime. But looking at Min-ah, he realized he had only built a more expensive cage. She was the mirror he had spent a lifetime smashing. Her small, trembling hands on his sleeve were a physical bridge to the person he used to be, the boy who believed that love was worth more than the law of the streets. She had done for her father what Joon-Seok had failed to do for his mother. She had acted out of a pure, reckless devotion that didn't stop to calculate the cost. The iron rules he lived by suddenly felt like rusted chains. He had always told himself that his lack of mercy was a shield for the neighborhood, a way to keep the chaos at bay. But Min-ah's confession had pierced that shield effortlessly. He saw now that he wasn't protecting his territory. He was merely presiding over a cycle of misery that he had once been a victim of himself. Joon-Seok looked down at his own hands, clean, manicured, and stained with the metaphorical blood of 1,000 business decisions. Then he looked at Min-ah's hands, stained with the honest dirt of a child who had walked alone to a funeral hall to save her father's dignity. The contrast was a silent, devastating indictment. He realized then that he didn't want to break her. He wanted to protect the part of her that he had lost. The boss reached out, not to push her away, but to steady her shaking shoulders. The ice in his veins didn't melt, but it cracked, revealing a long-forgotten spark of humanity beneath. The cracked mirror of Joon-Seok's past fell away, replaced by the cold, biting reality of the present. His gaze shifted from the trembling girl to the men standing in the periphery. the human wall he had built to guard his empire. For the first time, he didn't see them as loyal extensions of his own will. He saw them as vultures. He remembered the ledger. The report had claimed $50,000 were missing, but a funeral for a woman of the slums, even with the most predatory of directors, wouldn't cost a fifth of that. Minna had taken the money, but she hadn't taken it all. Joon-Seok's hand remained on the girl's shoulder, his touch surprisingly steadying, but his eyes turned into twin chips of black ice. He looked at his lead lieutenant, Sang-ho, whose posture had shifted from at ease to a subtle, defensive rigidity. The man was avoiding the boss's eyes, his hand hovering a little too close to his own holstered weapon. "Sang-ho," Joon-Seok said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a vibration that seemed to rattle the very windows of the alley. "The girl says she paid the funeral director. That accounts for maybe 10,000. Tell me, where did the other 40 go?" The lieutenant stammered, the rain catching in his throat. "Boss, she's a kid. She's confused. She probably dropped the rest or the director scammed her. We found the empty bag in Hyun's closet just like we reported." "I have a rule about children, Sang-ho," Joon-Seok interrupted, his voice deceptively soft. "I don't bring them into business, but I have a more important rule about family. We protect this neighborhood because if we don't, we're just common thugs. We don't prey on widows. We don't frame fathers." He stepped away from Minna, moving toward the line of enforcers. Each step was a deliberate promise of violence. He saw the flicker of guilt in the eyes of the two men standing behind Sang-ho. They weren't just enforcers. They were thieves who had found a way to skim from the collections, using the desperate poverty of men like Hyun as a convenient shroud for their greed. They had expected Joon-Seok to pull the trigger and close the case forever. They had expected the judge to be blind. Joon-Seok realized then that the rot wasn't just in the streets. It had metastasized within his own inner circle. These men had watched a child survive on bread and hope for 3 days while they pocketed the money meant for her mother's dignity. They had turned his iron rules into a weapon of convenience. The handgun in Joon-Seok's holster felt heavy, not with the weight of an execution, but with the necessity of a purge. He didn't look back at Hyun or Minna. He kept his eyes locked on the traitors. The Court of Shadows was about to witness a different kind of justice. The air in the alleyway curdled, the temperature dropping as the predatory grace of Kang Joon-Seok shifted into something primal. He didn't scream. He didn't roar. He simply moved. The handgun was out of its holster before Sang-ho could even draw breath. The first shot was a deafening crack that shattered the rhythm of the falling rain, the muzzle flash illuminating the terror in the lieutenant's eyes for one final, blinding second. Sang-ho collapsed like a marionette with its strings cut, his hand still frozen on the grip of a weapon he was too slow to use. The two men behind him scrambled, their discipline disintegrating into frantic, animal panic. They reached for their holsters, but they were fighting a man who had been forged in the very fires of the hell they had tried to create. Joon-Seok moved through the mist like a phantom, his pristine black suit a blur of lethal precision. 2 more shots rang out, surgical and cold, dropping the traitors into the oily puddles before they could clear their barrels. The remaining 4 enforcers, those who hadn't been part of the scheme but had stood by in silent complicity, threw themselves to the pavement. They knew the rules. They knew that in this moment, Joon-Seok wasn't just their boss. He was the personification of the neighborhood's wrath. Joon-Seok stood over the fallen, the smoke from his barrel curling into the damp air. He didn't look at the bodies. His gaze was fixed on the survivors, his voice a low, terrifying rasp that cut through the ringing in their ears. "You watched a child beg. You watched a father break. And you said nothing because you thought it wasn't your business." He ejected the spent magazine, the metal clinking against the concrete, and slid a fresh one home with a hollow, metallic snick. "In this territory, that makes you as guilty as they were. Clean this up. Not a drop of blood remains by dawn. If I see any of you in this district again, you won't get 90 seconds. You'll get 1. The enforcers scrambled to obey, their movements frantic and subservient. The wall of stone had been demolished, replaced by the desperate scramble of men who had seen the true face of the dragon. Joon-Seok finally turned back toward the center of the alley. The violence had been swift, a sudden storm that left the air smelling of cordite and copper. He saw Minna, her hands still over her ears, her eyes wide as she stared at the man who had just dismantled his own world to save hers. He holstered his weapon and walked toward the kneeling father, the judge, finally stepping out of the shadows and into the light. The echoes of the gunshots lingered in the narrow space, a ringing silence that felt heavier than the noise. Joon-Seok walked back toward the center of the alley, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. The human wall was gone, replaced by the frantic shadows of the remaining men dragging the traitors into the dark. He stopped in front of Park Di-hyun. The father was still on his knees, his body shielding Minna, though the girl had let go of her ears and was watching the boss with a gaze that held no fear, only a haunting, quiet understanding. Joon-Seok reached into his jacket. Instead of a weapon, he pulled out a thick, leather-bound envelope, the collection from earlier that evening. He didn't drop it. He knelt down, his expensive trousers soaking in the grime of the pavement, and placed the envelope directly into Di-hyun's trembling hands. "There are $40,000 in here," Joon-Seok said, his voice no longer a judgment but a low, steady anchor. "The funeral hall director will receive a call tonight. The rest of your debt is erased, not because of mercy, but because the interest was paid in the blood of the men who tried to steal your life." Di-hyun stared at the envelope, his breath hitching in his chest. I can't take this, boss, I didn't." "Take it," Joon-Seok commanded, his tone brooking no argument. He looked at Minna, then back at the father. He reached out and gripped Di-hyun's chin, forcing the man to look him in the eye. "You have something most men in this city would kill to possess. You have a daughter who walked into the mouth of a lion to pull you out. Do not make her sacrifice a waste." Joon-Seok's gaze softened, a rare and fleeting shadow of the boy he had once been flickering in his eyes. "Go home, feed her, fix your house, and from this moment on you be a father worth dying for. Because if you ever fail her, if you ever make her feel that alone again, it won't be a debt of money I come to collect." He stood up, the rain slicking his hair back, making his features look as though they were carved from dark marble. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, white handkerchief. He handed it to Minna so she could wipe the mud from her hands. Di-hyun clutched the envelope to his chest, sobbing quietly, but this time the tears were clean. He stood up unsteadily, gathering Minna into his arms. The girl looked over her father's shoulder at Joon-Seok, her small hand clutching the handkerchief like a talisman. Joon-Seok watched them walk toward the mouth of the alley. He was still a mafia boss, and he was still a dangerous man, but the iron rules had been rewritten in the span of a few heartbeats. He had refilled a debt, but in doing so, he had started to pay off a much older one of his own. The rain began to taper off, leaving the alley in a shimmering, obsidian quiet. As Di-hyun turned to lead Minna away from the scene of the purge, Joon-Seok spoke one last time. It wasn't a command, but a request that carried the weight of a sacred vow. "Minna." The little girl stopped and turned. Her father paused with her, his arm protectively around her shoulders, his eyes still wide with the shock of his sudden salvation. Joon-Seok reached into his waistcoat and withdrew a small, matte black business card. It bore no name, no address, and no title, only a single embossed emblem of a dragon coiled around a sword, and a private phone number printed in silver. He walked toward her, the towering enforcers in the shadows stepping back to give the boss his path. Joon-Seok knelt once more, ignoring the ruined state of his suit. He held the card out to Minna. "Tonight, you were the only one in this city brave enough to tell the truth," Joon-Seok said, his voice a low, resonant rumble. "That bravery comes with a price, but in this neighborhood it now comes with a shield. If the world ever feels too big again, if the shadows ever grow too long, or if someone ever tries to make you afraid, you call this number. Minna reached out, her fingers brushing against his as she took the card. The card was heavy, made of metal rather than paper, feeling like a literal piece of armor in her palm. "Who will answer?" she asked softly. "The dragon," Joon-Seok replied, a ghost of a smile touching the corners of his mouth, the first genuine expression his face had worn in years. "And he will come for you. No questions asked. No debts owed." He looked up at Hyun, the warning in his eyes replaced by a grim understanding. "She is no longer just your daughter, Hyun. She is under the protection of the dragon. Treat her as the treasure she is." Joon-Seok stood up and stepped back, merging into the darkness of the court of shadows that he had reclaimed. He watched as the father and daughter finally emerged from the mouth of the alley and onto the main street, disappearing into the glow of the city lights. For the first time in his life, Joon-Seok didn't feel the cold. He looked down at his sleeve where the faint, muddy print of Minna's hand remained. He wouldn't have the suit cleaned. He would keep it as a reminder that even in a world of monsters, a single whisper of truth could bring a king to his knees. He turned to his remaining men, his voice snapping back to the sharp authority of a commander. "We're done here. Let's go home." The seasons turned with the relentless indifference of the city, and the years eventually smoothed the jagged edges of that rain-slicked night. In the high-rise office overlooking the East District, the air no longer tasted of ozone and copper, but of aged oak and quiet success. Kang Joon-Seok sat behind his desk, a man grayer at the temples but sharper in his resolve. He had remained the judge, but the laws of his court had fundamentally shifted. The neighborhood flourished not under the weight of his boot, but under the shadow of his wing. His office remained a fortress, a place of maps and strategy. On the north wall, a massive, backlit topographical display showed every dock, every alley, and every street he protected. It was a map of power, of territory won and held through a decade of calculated silence. But it was no longer the most important thing in the room. To the right of the map, held in a simple silver frame that caught the morning sun, was a photograph. It showed a young woman in a deep blue graduation gown, holding a degree in education with a smile that could light up the darkest alley in the city. Her hair was no longer in a messy ponytail, and her hands were no longer stained with the grime of the streets, but her eyes, wide, brown, and fiercely honest, remained exactly as Joon-Seok remembered them. Minna had kept her promise. She had grown up safe, protected by a silent guardian who ensured that no bad men ever crossed her threshold again. And every year, on the anniversary of her mother's funeral, a bouquet of white lilies would appear at her door with no note, only the faint scent of expensive tobacco and the knowledge that the dragon was still watching. Joon-Seok stood and walked to the window, looking down at the bustling streets below. He had done terrible things in his life, and he knew that his soul was still a ledger written in red. But as he glanced back at the photo on his wall, he knew that one entry was different. In a world where debts were paid in blood and hope was a luxury for the foolish, a 7-year-old girl with a whisper of truth had managed to buy his humanity for the price of a single secret. He had been the monster she needed him to be so that she could become the light he could never reach. Joon-Seok adjusted his tie, the silk smooth against his skin, and felt a rare, profound peace. He was still the most dangerous man in the city, but he was also the man who had been saved by a child who refused to run. The legacy of that whisper lived on, a bridge between the monster he was and the man he had once hoped to be. And for Kang Joon-Seok, that was a debt he would be honored to spend the rest of his life paying.